the panel will be, generally speaking, if I kind of take the title as it is right now, because a lot of things have changed since we came with the idea, is we'll talk about the transformation that we're seeing both in enterprises and in telcos. I think we have a fairly distinguished list of panelists here, 5 on the list. We'll start with a quick introduction. First of all, my name is Nati. Shalom. I'm the CTO and founder of Gigaspaces, an Israeli startup over the last 15 years. I shouldn't call it startup anymore. I'll let the rest of the panelists introduce themselves. So let's do a quick introduction. Saar,
Sure. Saar Gillai. By the way, I assume this is Israeli, so within half an hour, everybody will show up, right? They're drinking coffee right now. I run the communications business at HP.
That's the mic.
Hi, everyone. Shalom. My name is Eran Bello. I'm from Israel, and I'm the Vice President of Product and Marketing at ASOCS.
Hi, I'm Jamie Finn with AT&T. I'm responsible for the big data group on the West Coast, so all the analytics and engineering side of it.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm the CEO of Twistlock, a container security company.
Hi, I'm Milo Sprague, CTO of Silicon Valley Bank.
Okay, great. So just one comment before we would start the dialogue and the questions. By all means, the question that I have to the panelists is just to strive the discussion. If you do have questions, just raise your hands. It's really, we really want to address your questions on the table and not just the topic that we thought of. I'll start with kind of a quick introduction to the topic. There's been a big news recently with the EMC and Dell, which I think marked an end of an era to a large degree of all this cloud transformation. Everyone here familiar with that deal, Dell and EMC? Yeah. So we're all seeing this dinosaurs company are now striving or struggling with their survival, and new companies coming over and taking over. And the question for you, Saar, is how do you see the transformation being part of a big company like HP, which is part of those, if you like, gorilla companies?
Sure. Well, I think it's an interesting deal. It's, the question is, are you solving the problems of the past or the future, right? Are you looking at the future or are you looking to the past? Obviously the cloud and everything that's happened around the cloud has caused massive transformations in IT. Our view is that, we've already seen that and we've done our transformations. You might know HP actually splitting up on November 1st into different companies. But we've already seen it. So when we look at what other people are doing, we're saying that it's a bit late to do that. This is something that they maybe should have done a while before. You really need to think about where the market is going. Personally, on that specific deal, I think it's important to remember that Silver Lake is a financial company.
Do you think it's likely that we'll see HP, Oracle, Cisco even, all those names here in a couple of years?
Yeah, I think
obviously that's a rhetorical question for you.
Yeah, no, look, people forget that they forget the certain elements of these large companies, right? And they talk about technology, right? At the end of the day, I'm happy to talk about the wonders of technology, but HP, for example, right, has sales capabilities and support capabilities, I don't know, 160 countries and so on. So, you can't, that's not something that you can replace. And Oracle or Cisco, the same thing. So you can talk about, it's very nice for the press to talk about dinosaurs and so forth. What you're seeing is something different. And there's a difference between the economic situation and the stock market view of the world, which is, of course, important for shareholders, right? Growth has slowed down. Even HP, when you talk about HP during all the discussions in the press, taking us to the cleaners and talking about how all it messes up, HP was still cash flow positive and generating billions of dollars in cash flow. And you can say the same thing about Oracle and Cisco and so on, even though they're getting pounded. But the truth is, yes, the big growth is in new areas where you have to go find it. One of the reasons I would say that Dell is trying to do this deal is they realize in the personal computers, Dell is mostly a personal computers with some SMB. They're not big in the enterprise. And they're basically realizing there's no growth there because they're out of the mobile device business. So, what's the possibilities? What can they do? And they're saying, okay, I can go bet on the enterprise. And the problem is by the time they finish their bet on the enterprise, it's not clear how much money they'll be there. But that's what they're doing. So I think just because people say, oh, these companies, there is, we need to separate between the hype, growth, and viability. Those are not the same thing.
So the next question is basically to the AT&T of the world, for those who are not less familiar. Another big company is going through that transformation. We all know that Telco is going through a big challenge in this world. They've been actually threatened by non-Telco guys like Google and all the rest of the things. How do you see that transformation and how that manifests into the AT&T strategy?
Yeah, I mean, and so I'm relatively new in AT&T, so 7 months in, and to me it's been revolutionary in terms of what AT&T is doing around the network to drive costs out of the business. We have a business model which doesn't necessarily continue to scale the same way we expect, so we have to fundamentally change the way we're doing things. Because we're doing that and moving to software-defined networking and working with some partners up here, we've absolutely changed the direction we're going now. Earlier, there was a chap here speaking on behalf of Yahoo about how he wouldn't want to be a telco now because they're all going to crash and burn and be worth nothing. I found that really curious coming from Yahoo, who is sort of in the exact situation. I would rather be us at this point, knowing that we're just going to be removing costs from the business with really innovative technology. If you haven't seen what we're doing in the domain 2 space, it might actually surprise you to see our bigger threats are people like Google, but learning network is a little bit harder than learning how to do storage and backup. It's a slightly different business, and you can always rely on good partners like HP for that.
And that, I think, is a good leeway to run. I mean, you mentioned the word V before G, meaning, can you explain what V before G means?
Sure, but I just give a very short background.
Sure.
So ASOCS is a startup company in Israel that developed a virtual base station product. We basically look at the $50 billion market of base station for LTE, and we say enough of the vendor lock of specific dedicated hardware for this purpose. And the challenges, there's of course the money and the cost, but it's not just that. If you look on how base stations are built today, they serve specific purpose of such type of LTE functionality. Now, the world is looking into 5G by 2020, for example. And 5G, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the main concepts of 5G, but it's basically not just one protocol that a cell phone needs to support. It's 4 different protocols, which mean 4 times the networks that a carrier like AT&T will have to build. And it's just not scalable anymore. So if a carrier like AT&T or the similar would want to move to 5G, first they need to virtualize their network completely, separate the hardware and the software of the base station so they can just build distributed data centers at the half of the cost of the proprietary hardware and run any type of base stations they want or protocol they want, any type of 5G, 6G, 10G. And this is why I basically say, before we go and keep counting more Gs, first we have to start counting Vs.
Excellent. So I would say that one thing is that if are there any startups in this room? Raise their hand. Just to understand the profile here. Okay. VCs. Okay. Okay. So I think I got some idea of the audience here. One thing to comment here is that a big transformation is a challenge, but also an opportunity, definitely for startups. And I'm sure the people in the room here knows. I think what Eran startup do is definitely an interesting way to approach that market. And that gets me to the next speaker in the panel. You're kind of dealing with transformation, and you kind of jump over the technology right into the next generation of the next generation, which is containers.
Yeah.
Maybe you could say a few words about that and how your startup is actually, Ben,
sure, and
positioning itself to that.
Before I even get into that, you said that it's really important that we disagree to some extent. So I actually worked in Microsoft for 14 years, and it was really interesting to see how Microsoft responded to change. And I'm sitting in a room of Microsoft, so I'll be careful. I'll choose my words carefully. I don't want anything to happen to me. But I'm just saying that I think big companies, sometimes it takes them a lot of time to actually transform. Look at how long it took Microsoft to actually admit that it's a services and devices company, and how long it actually takes them to deliver on that. And I think HP and I think other of the companies that you mentioned should, they should actually, raise their head and see where everything is going. And specifically around the topic that we talk about today, this whole developer-defined infrastructure. If I may use the words of Jerry Chen from Greylock. I mean, this is something that's happening, and we really see the transformation. And a lot of the companies are actually reaching out because there's no solution to that. They are reaching out to startups. And I've worked in Microsoft, and it was really amazing to see back then how people reach out to us. And I thought, oh, that's because I'm Microsoft. But now we're a startup, and we actually see big companies reach out to us and ask us for our solution because there's not a lot of things out there. And specifically, I'm working on developer-defined infrastructure security solution because there's a big movement around, enabling, empowering developers. And, big companies have all these paradigms of how things should be, and they're very slow to respond. So anyway.
Actually, a question on that regard before to Milo is, being in Microsoft, now being in the startup, what did Microsoft do differently than all others, Cisco, all the HP of the world, and the rest, in your view?
What did they do differently in
the sense of addressing that the gigantic shift we're facing? Because clearly, I think they were able to make the transition.
Yeah, but it took them quite a while. And honestly, I had stocks in Microsoft all these years, and I was hoping they will go up, and it never happened. I was there for.
It was a good dividend.
There was a reasonable dividend. Actually, the move to dividend was sort of a disappointment because you sort of realize, this is not going to grow. And I think Microsoft did it pretty poorly. And I think there was a very big change recently with the CEO change. And they did it the right way. They eventually changed, but I think it took them years and years just to realize that at some point they realized that the cloud is there, but they didn't do anything about it. They just said we're all in, but it wasn't clear all in what direction. Now it seems like they're moving in the right direction. They're enabling developers finally. Azure sort of got the right angle. Anyway, so I think we're going to see a lot of good things coming from Microsoft. That's everyone's expectation. You can see the stock goes up because of that, but I think that's the right part. The wrong part that it took them so long because they were saying, we own the enterprise, we have the best selling channels, we don't need to change so much. It takes years and years.
I see Saar wants to respond to that, so let him before I jump over to Milo. Yeah.
Look, the raise the head part was the best part. I like that one. But the reality is, first of all, for all the startups, and I used to be in a bunch of startups as well, just remember the current state is not the new normal. At some point, profits will actually matter. Every 7 years that happens, we're just about there. So, the thing that to understand for large companies, it is true, and I think, if you talk about Microsoft specifically, I would say that Microsoft's problem was they saw Windows was the center of the universe. So many large companies, because they're very successful, they forget they get confused why they're successful. And they think they're successful because of one thing, they focus on that one thing, then they realize, like IBM, if you remember, realized that they were actually successful because they're a services company, not a mainframe company. And when they turned into a services company, they finally succeeded. Now Satya has realized that Microsoft is sort of the enterprise enabler for developers, and they're back on the success, not only focused on Windows. If they would have tried to design a phone that people could use versus a phone that uses Windows, maybe they would have done a better job. And HP is the same thing. In some cases, maybe HP forgot why customers work with HP and focus in other areas. Obviously, you're always going to see more innovation coming out of startups because it's a risk-reward issue. You got to remember, don't confuse announcements and new ideas with revenue. And unfortunately, public companies have to do revenue, and unfortunately, they have to do it on a quarterly basis. And so these transitions are naturally difficult, but people shouldn't underestimate, whenever you're building a company, I'm sure those of you who've done startups, right, the hardest part is not the technology, the hardest part is go to market. That's why they're always looking for me to partner, right? Because they always want a big company to do go to market for them, and that's the advantage that these big companies have. Now, the problem is, do they know how to use them? And many of them don't, but that's a big advantage that they have.
So, Milo, are you representing here kind of a small to medium bank, a Silicon Valley bank, that is also facing the transformation? Why don't you describe how you see the transformation, how the bank is targeting that?
Yeah, so prior to SVB, I worked for many years at Morgan Stanley, which is obviously a much larger global corporation. Then consulting across kind of the major investment banks and a lot of other large banks. So it's been very interesting for the last 4.5 years to be at SVB, where we have like the bird's eye view across everything that's going on in the valley and the great innovation that's going on. But we actually are a much smaller buyer, and we actually are, quite frankly, kind of behind, obviously, a bulge bracket investment bank. To give an idea of size, we're 2,000 employees, about 3,000 people, including contractors. We have 2,000 virtualized servers on a traditional like Cisco, VMware stack. We have Microsoft, Oracle, the usual cast of characters. So as I came into the bank, 4 years ago, taking a look at cloud strategy, initially that was just focused on software as a service, right? Because we had plenty of opportunity to move, kind of commercial off-the-shelf technology out of like our data center and into the cloud. And we had many successful. We had about 1 or 2 SaaS applications. We came up with a strategy. We now have 65 going on 70 applications in the cloud, software as a service. We focused on virtualization. We focused mainly on our VMware stack, right? So that's really not cloud, right? We actually, I don't know if you guys remember CICC, and like Cisco made an acquisition and came out with kind of an early attempt at private cloud orchestration. We took a look at that. What we realized is that we really didn't have skills. Like we have skills to manage a traditional Cisco VMware shop, but building a cloud, a true private or hybrid cloud, is a very big undertaking. We have 200 people in IT. That's something that I think these guys can do, and it's certainly something where you have an order of magnitude or several order of magnitude difference in scale, where the investment makes sense. So for us, we really are relying on our vendors, our partners, and also the great thing about SVB is we are relying also on clients where we see an opportunity, especially in the cloud. So what's interesting for me as I hear the conversation is figuring out for example, cloud security. Like a big thing for me, what's next for us is infrastructure as a service and moving our proprietary software, which is only about 20% of our applications, into horizontally scalable cloud applications. So that's where we have an opportunity to work with guys like you and figure out how can we do containers, how can we work in Amazon, how can we manage our keys effectively so we can get out there and take advantage. But we're still going to have the huge preponderance of commercial off-the-shelf closed systems that don't have access by web services. They don't have API access. So we have more file-based integrations. We're going to rely on our Oracle Service Bus and expose that as REST up to that front-end capability. So you look at a full-stack hybrid cloud opportunity, that's really kind of more than we want to bite off and chew right now. It makes a lot more sense for a Morgan Stanley or a much larger organization. But at the same time, we want to keep a close eye on that, and as it becomes more accessible and more kind of commonplace as we can get skills in the organization, we want to be right there and ready to jump when the time is right.
Good. So I think the next question, actually touching on what Saar mentioned about the revenue, that we, at the end of the day, needs to build a sustainable business model, and the sustainable business model had to generate also revenue. And what we're seeing is, I think we talked about the gorilla of the world and how they're struggling it. But at the same time, there was another deal this week, actually this Friday, Red Hat bought Ansible, for example, which if you think about it, the market of configuration management is relatively new. It's not the gorilla of the world. There's Puppet and Chef that are now all of a sudden considered legacy in this world. And now they're being disrupted themselves. And it looks like there is a vicious cycle of disruption of companies, even startups that were built to cloud, not the gorilla of the world, building a business model that is now based on adoption and open source and all those type of things that says, let's build the market first, get the adoption, and then monetize on it. But all of a sudden, at the time that they monetize, they're being disrupted. So how do, in your view, the startup of the world disrupt themselves or plan for that disruption? Because it's not just the gorilla is going to be disrupted. And to Saar's view, is there any sustainable business model in this world? I'll ask you. Yeah.
Okay, so actually, if we talk again about Satya, I'm sorry that, because we're sitting in Microsoft. So the one thing he said that he learned from Steve Ballmer was that every day is a new day and you need to reinvent yourself. So I think that's the only lesson. I mean, you need to keep your eyes open. You need to understand the change. You need to understand the macro movement, and you need to rearrange yourself on a constant basis. So there were a lot of companies, for example, that were betting on the PaaS platform to look a certain way, and now Docker came out, and practically anything that's moving to the cloud these days uses that in so many good ways. So, they can either keep insisting that they're going to deliver their own platform using whatever the used to do, or they can adjust. And you see that the more successful ones are the ones that keep evolving. You see companies that got funded in 2010, they just repivoted over time, and they use the assets that they used to build in the past in order to create new things. I think that's the only way you could actually do that. That's the way I see it, anyway.
Yeah. So James, how do you?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's just one thing I want to latch onto that you said, and it's if you're looking at acquisitions or working with these spaces and the disruption, the thing that people don't value enough about smaller companies is the operational knowledge that they have. And knowing how to run something is more often than not more important than inventing something new. And when you have this operational knowledge, you're then able to do, the wonderful word, pivot into new spaces because you understand how something works fundamentally. The reason you're able to have these, I mean, to be fair, rather forward-thinking points of view on this is you're sitting neck deep in the market, you can see it happening before it happens, and then you're able to adjust. A larger company, we don't have the same fluidity, for lack of a better term.
So I think that if you look at what Apple did in the past, there is this known saying of if there's going to be a disruption, better disrupt yourself before someone else disrupts you. But as you said, it's still a big challenge for big companies to deal with that. Again, how do you deal with that yourself? How do you disrupt yourself?
Well, I mean,
do you disrupt yourself?
Yeah, at AT&T, we're definitely doing that. So we're in the middle of retraining our workforce. We have a whole Mission 2020 that John Donovan is running our whole business. So we're in the middle of virtualizing all of our mobile network. We're already at 5% of the network. By 2020, we should be there with as much as we can do, which we figure is about 80%. When we're there, it's a totally different work environment at a totally different scale. And so there's a huge amount of investment in education going on inside of the business. It's clear, just like every other company in the world, some people get on the bus, some people don't, and that's where you end up. And so we are a legacy business. We've been in America for over 100 years operating. We have a lot of complexity around that. And so I'd say, from a management point of view, that's going to be the more difficult piece. Acquisitions like DirecTV give us more scale in new business units, which change if I told you right now, the number one line of business for AT&T was not mobile, you might be surprised to hear that. It's actually number 4 for us. So it's a very different business than what people envisaged it as originally.
So Saar, I think you mentioned that the transformation that we're discussing here right now also involves cultural transformation and not just the technology transformation. And in your view of the market, you've seen the companies trying to do the right things, but are getting stuck there.
So I have a few comments.
Sure.
First of all, I agree with James. Culture is the biggest thing, and that's why he's talking about the bus, right? I mean, Don Donovan has sort of set direction, and for those of you who are familiar with Don, he's set up some. And I work with the various telcos, and I see folks who are on the bus and folks who are on the bus, and that's the biggest problem. People talk about technology, but the technology is available. When you compare the telcos with the OTTs, the problem is the telcos have spent 20 years building a perfect network that now has to change, and they feel very comfortable with it. And the OTTs didn't start there, and so have a different culture. And so, it's like I'd like to tell people, you can't do DevOps if you don't have any devs. But I want to comment back on your disruption statement. The thing that we have a problem with startups is we have survivor bias. Okay, for those who know, right, what that means, which is we only focus on the survivors. Disruptive is very painful, and most disruptors die. Okay. So it's very nice to talk about big companies. Why aren't you disrupting? Why aren't you doing this? Look at all these startups, but you don't count the 90% of the startups that never make it and spend VC money, right? And so you got to remember not to just look at survivor bias. There's a lot of actually things happening in large companies. And most things that are happening in the private market actually don't succeed. That doesn't mean they shouldn't do it. I think it's a great system. The startup ecosystem is a perfect ecosystem for disruption because you can do it in a place where you don't have quarterly earnings that you have to manage. In terms of how do you create a disruption in large companies, I think the things that people always forget is people do what you reward them for. It's very simple, okay? If you reward for quarterly earnings, you'll get quarterly earnings. If you get somebody a reward, like Donovan set a target in AT&T that said, okay, we must be virtualized by this much, and your reward will be tied to that, as opposed to their current reward system, which is network uptime, right? If you reward someone for network uptime, they're not going to put a new software in there because the chances of the network uptime being disrupted by that are very high. So why would they take the risk? So if you want to drive behavior in any environment, you have to manage the reward system to do that.
And Eran, maybe you could talk about something that is happening with the new stuff that you bring in the base station, is that the network itself becomes virtualized. It's a big shift. especially in telco world, those are less familiar with that. There is a term called SDN. There is another term that is called NFV, which is basically, without going too deep into that, it's the network piece, the switches, the IP, all the network that we're dealing with right now is now available through API, which means that I can, as a programmer, program a new network and create new switches and so forth without having any middleman in the process. Now, that in itself sounds promising, as in cloud, that a developer can actually operate his own things without having the middleman in between. But it's a very big organizational change, culture change. Do we see developers accessing network directly, creating network directly in a telco?
Yeah, so I think what's most amazing about NFV, network function virtualization transformation in the telco, which is really the getting telco into enterprise mind of thinking from the network point of view, of course, not from the service, is that for the first time in 30 years, it came from the carriers. If you look on how the telecom market developed for the last 20, 30 years, it's always came from the vendors that told the carriers what they should do and what protocol they should run and how they should build the network and how they should give them so much money to operate it for them. And with NFV, about 3 years ago, came 5 of the top carriers of the world and say, enough, we are changing the model. We are taking control of our networks, and we're going to virtualize them. We're going to move them from proprietary hardware to standard virtualized infrastructure, data center infrastructure, and we're going to run all this application as a service, as a virtual machines or containers, right? And this really changed the whole food chain and the business model of this market, where if before they were speaking to 4, 5, maybe 10 vendors that spoke to 100 vendors below that did the application, and they spoke with whatever number of silicon provider below that. This transformation enabled a startup direct approach to huge carriers, mega carriers, working with them directly to enable them to do this transformation. So, of course, the large organization that have worldwide service and solution capabilities has a major role in this transformation to at the end of the day, to facilitate and deliver this to the carriers and work with the carrier closely. But it's the first time that startups have opportunity to work directly with the largest of all and together change the way things works.
That's a very good pointer to James, actually, on the startup side.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's, I mean, a lot of the things we're doing here these days are looking for applications that we can run in this programmatic network. I mean, the programmable network we're building, we're going to need applications for. Everything's going to be virtualized. So you get a lot more scale, a lot more quickly to a business. And so that, I mean, in particular, I happen to be focused on the security space at the moment, right? There's a ton of amazing security companies out there. There's some I saw earlier today. I was really shocked, and then you speak to them, and they, oh yeah, we could just run that as a virtual app. So it's exactly where we need to be.
Can you elaborate on that? Because I think at least the startups this room would want to understand exactly the opportunity that you're discussing here right now. What is the kind of startup?
Well, I mean, today our guys are out there selling, for example, FireEye or any one of these other kind of big box vendors, and they kind of drop it in, and that's fantastic. But so now we've actually virtualized those. You can buy them just as services through a web portal. Basically, anybody can do it. Well, there's no reason that they have to be only now these big vendors, because it's software and we can scale it as a virtualized app. So then that's where, I think the dynamics of the market start to change. To go into the fundamental or finer details, I can't, because it's early days. We're talking something 2020. But it is happening, and it's not like there's no debate.
Exposing API to your network that others can develop to.
Yeah, so there's no debate that this is going to happen. It's happening. It's a question of how fast. Mm-hmm. And every operator in the world will do this, guaranteed.
Question from the audience before I continue. Is there anyone who have a question to the panelist? Okay, so the next question. Yes. Okay, go ahead, Saar.
I mean, I agree. What the telcos are trying to do is foster this innovation and get startups involved. It's running into some cultural challenges. That's why James is saying, well, we don't know exactly how long it's going to take, because while they've built the programmatics and made everything, and we're actually trying to build a whole ecosystem in HP to get the startups on board on the platforms, because we're also trying to push it in that direction because we provide the platforms. They got to get through the fact that you don't have to do 2 years of POCs and so forth, because a startup can't survive. So there's a culture shift going on to enable that, And so I would just warn any startup that's going after the telco market, know what you're getting yourself into. Make sure you're well funded. Just because some PhDs in a lab somewhere are interested from AT&T or from Verizon, not to pick, or from Telefonica, that doesn't mean you're going to see a PO in your lifetime. They like to test a lot of stuff. So just be aware. I mean, it is the good news about this market. Once you're in. But getting in is a very, very hard. It's not it's a 2-year process. Now, we in the industry are working to make it, HP is working with the telcos to make it much easier, but it's not there yet.
One other thing on that, I mean, the biggest challenge we have, particularly in the data space that we're working, is we have no way to work with startups very quickly, to your point, in a very fluid way. So we have some initiatives that have been set up, Foundry and what have you, which are well publicized, but still, our data in particular, which is the single most interesting asset that we have, is not available to anybody. In fact, it's not available to internal employees and only a very, very small set. And so, as we work through that challenge and creating environments where we can work together, I mean, I had a company the other day come and show us something where they brought the customers, they brought the banks, right? Like, all these banks want to work, all we need is this social network data feed, which is just call logs, whatever. It's no big deal, right? It's something every telco in the world has. They've done it with 15 telcos around the world, tens of millions of dollars. Great. They show up at our door. It's like, no chance, buddy. You don't even bother coming through the door, because we have such a AT&T is such a private mental kind of block around exposing any data to anyone in any shape or form, which also hinders our movement to the cloud. And so, it's a real challenge in that space. So if we can find a way to work with third parties in a very fast and fluid way, so that we have kind of a safe room environment, that would be a tremendous value to us.
So Ron, being Milo, I'll pass on the mic in just 1 second. I just want to actually touch on that. Eran is actually representing a startup that is targeting that big market with a 2-year cycle. How do you deal with that? How many people?
So we do two things. We do two things. We do the push and the pull. So we go to the largest carriers of all, and we make the pull, and we get to the labs, and we work together with them to show them the value that they can get. But I agree, every startup needs to build a business model that is driven for success. So what we do in that sense is we identified a sub-market within the huge networks of the AT&T and the likes, which is the in-building, for example, the venues, the enterprise. And it's a huge market. It's like a $4 or $5 billion market that also needs service. And in this market, the carriers already, in a way, realize that because all the carriers needs to be in the building at the end of the day, they need to share the wireless coverage. So every large casino or amusement park or complex or university and so on, the network there is typically not an individual carrier network. It's a distributed antenna system that gives coverage to all the carriers. So if you look on the basement of these buildings, what you will find there is that each carrier brings its own specific base stations. Mm-hmm. And it's not scalable once again. So one of our short-time, low-hanging fruits go-to-market model is to go after this opportunity. Of course, work with the carriers, get the blessings that our base station functionality and performance is good. But once it's there, it's much easier for the carrier to say, okay, that makes sense. Let's go there and let's start building distributed clouds. We're not aiming to get a startup into our main packet core where we need to open the APIs and deal with all the security and so on. We are going one by one in a scalable way that can move very fast to maybe not the whole $50 billion market, 10% of it, but that's still big enough.
Interesting. Yes, Milo.
I feel like it's that advertisement where we have to pass the pen, the company pen, right? Okay. That's right. No, I just wanted to kind of chime in and say that I think that from a financial services point of view, I've been in financial services my whole career. I think part of it's being at SVB, but what I'm noticing is I have colleagues in every one of the major bulge bracket investment banks and global banks. all of whom either have like some kind of an outpost or office here in the Valley now, or have somebody embedded in their, in their banking organization that's focused on startups. Many of these companies have a whole team that's just specifically looking at technology startups. We just did an acquisition of a startup, Standard Treasury. We acquired to help move forward our API banking initiative, which is to allow secured access via APIs to fintech companies, so we can be actually part of the disruption. We're a very small company relative. I've got colleagues at these larger organizations. So I think you just mentioned that you had a whole host of the same guys I'm talking about, like kind of lining up to see like what are you guys doing, because they all have contracts with you and with HP and Cisco, and they want to know what innovation you're doing. They can take advantage of that. But then they're also, I think, increasingly more interested in going direct. In my experience, it's been the cloud and all of the transformation that you're describing and we're talking about today, that large enterprises, including banks, are noticing that you can't just rely on your major, kind of top 5, 7, 10 vendors to provide everything you're going to need, and that the market's going to move away from you, whether that's like a lending club, or a Ripple, or so a lot of the disruption that's going on. And then also from a technology
question on that regard. Yeah. I mean, it used to be an Oracle shop, and many organizations actually solve that technology challenge before by latching on the skills of big companies to actually solve their problem. And there used to be a saying, no one was fired for choosing IBM. Those type of things came from that world, and all of a sudden we're seeing a shift where you could actually be fired by choosing Oracle, or those type of things, and you're almost forced to move the other direction.
Oracle, I got a good story about Oracle.
How do you see that? I mean, are you going through that same transformation yourself?
Yeah. So I think it's not, to the comments made earlier, right, by you guys, like it's not like the pendulum has moved all the way over, and it's like, I think the point is the pendulum has moved, right, and that larger organizations are recognizing for the first time, really, maybe in my experience, that they have to be focused. I mean, they were probably focused somewhat, and it was more like a kind of a curiosity, and they were putting their toe in the water, or they talked to their bankers occasionally, or they talked to their lenders who are in the field, and got input more on an anecdotal basis. Now you're seeing like Cap One Labs has 110 people across 3 geographies in DC, New York, and San Francisco, driving most of their technology innovation. They just went all in on Amazon, right? Like just in the last month, right? So that's pretty, for a banking IT decision, that's kind of revolutionary for from in a regulatory industry. That's big news for someone like me. It's not big news, in industry, but Cap One Labs, right, has 5 years ago they had 3 people. Now they have 110 people in their lab. Now they're incubating solutions and taking over part of their engineering organization. So I mean, I'm a little bit jealous because these guys have much bigger, they measure, like VEBA measures their IT budget in tens of billions of dollars a year. We're still getting close to 100 million, right? So it's like a big difference, but there's lots of people paying attention, and also going back to their major vendors to look as well. But I think it's an interesting time to be a startup. I wouldn't say that all the doors are closed and that there is an opportunity there.
So there is a question to Saar there, but before that, I wanted to see if there is anyone in the audience that has any question. So Saar, you mentioned the business model challenge, and you mentioned a few things on that regard. One of them is that the company needs to have a sustainable business model, otherwise it wouldn't survive. Where we're actually seeing this is pouring money in a lot of startup companies and creating some sort of an unfair competition for big companies that doesn't have to go through that cycle, and in many cases, before they even need to justify the revenue or sustainable business model, they're getting acquired. How do you see that? And second, do you think that we're in the middle of a bubble? Is that going to end? Is that something that you feel that could survive?
Sure. Look, I think there was a discussion about pivoting as well, and I agree with what you said here. If you're solving a real problem and you have an insight into something, then you can pivot because you actually have some insight. If you don't have insight and you're just chasing the latest trend, then your pivot will probably not be that successful. At the end of the day, sure, you can do a little startup and get lucky and get bought without ever having a business model. But again, we have a survivorship bias. We remember the ones that were bought. We don't remember the 30 startups that didn't have a business model and vaporized. So the ones ultimately, statistically that are successful are ones that have a real business. Now, we go through cycles. You asked about a bubble, right? The market goes through cycles. There are cycles where as money gets cheaper, people reward growth. As money gets more expensive, people reward profit. And it goes through a cycle. In 2008, if you would have tried to sell somebody on growth with no profit, no one would do anything. Today, you can go get a $20 million valuation without a customer. But that's just tells you, I can't tell you whether it's going to end tomorrow, but I can tell you that it's a lot closer to ending than starting, just because if you look at the natural trend of things, you asked about EMC, so in the last time we had so many big M&A deals was 2007, okay? For those of you who were around in 2008. So, I think that startups need to be careful, and it's great if people are willing to give you money. Take as much money as you need, not more, because why would you give ownership? And make sure that it doesn't cloud you to the fact that you need a business model. Behave like you need to run a business, and don't believe in the hype, and don't live in the echo chamber of listening to your press announcements because no one else pays attention to them, right? There was this big thing about Theros. You saw this thing about these guys, worth $9 billion. If you look at that and you start digging into that, and I dug into it because I like to understand things, I think they started to believe in their own hype, and they got into this tornado, right? And once you believe in your own hype, then you basically don't listen to anything that challenges that hype. So we are, in my opinion, in a big bubble. I think, though, the way companies should navigate is maximize what you can get out of it, but don't let it blind you to actually building a business, because the party is going to, one day the music stops, could be tomorrow, could be March, probably no later than that. And then, those who are in business will survive. There's the hype and the build out, right? We're in the hype phase now. If you look at what happened during the bubble of 2000, the ones who survived did great because they were there to build out. And all of a sudden, after the fall, there's a lot less competition because all these companies that compete against you without making any money disappear. So, that's the way you should be approaching this.
Yep. Just quickly jump in.
Think about it also
I'm much more of an optimist
so
when it comes to this space. I don't necessarily believe the end of the world is coming. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure there is one always because it keeps going around the world. We have a lot of different economies moving a lot of different directions. So the US is absolutely in one place. Other places may be in different places. If you're doing a startup, keep doing it because it's the greatest thing in the world. I've done a bunch of them myself. And not believing, kind of being negative about the space and expecting the world to explode is not going to help you. So that's my only words on that.
Yeah, and I personally think that the interesting question is not whether there's a bubble or not, is just identifying the real change that is happening. I think that's the interesting discussion, right? I mean, there are some bubbles, it goes with hypes, but is there a real change happening, and is anyone addressing it? And I think that's the interesting question that we need to ask. I remember in 2007, I was actually having a discussion with the person that was in charge of Exchange in Microsoft, and I remember I told him that I don't believe how silly it is that, Google at the time were thinking that people will use Gmail for work. It sounded like kind of silly. And he told me, I told him, like, we're not going to do anything about it in Microsoft, right? And he said, no, we're actually starting a hosted service. And I thought, like, oh my God, who put that idiot there? I mean, like, who's going to use, like, mail is the most sacred thing in the world. No one would move it to the cloud. I mean, most of the traffic and most of the sensitive conversation is happening through mail. I mean, it's definitely not going to happen. It's not going to happen with big enterprises. And yeah, luckily enough, there was a bubble, everything burst. And but when we, but I think, yeah, no, but but. At the end of that cycle, everyone's using the cloud today for mail. So I think, I don't know. I think it doesn't matter if it's a bubble or not. I think the interesting question is there an interesting technological change? And I think the answer is yes. I don't think anyone argues with that.
So I'm going to just chime in the middle ground here, since we're all taking a point of view. So I think both of you guys kind of alluded to the fact that if you stick to a specific technology problem that is unique and is necessary, and you just laser focus on that, and you get it right, and you do something that hasn't been done, you're either going to get acquired really fast, or you're going to continue to grow and expand. And I think it's really when I talk to probably 100, 120 startups a year, and when I find out about the one that got acquired or the one that got like went public or what have you, had an exit, it's usually not the one that had this really kind of broad story across like all of the security and how they were going to displace every tool, or it's, you know, the guy that was going to completely transform my ability to like leverage like software as a service with some dashboard that does everything. But it's the like one guy who's coming up with a better container that's secured and it's easier to deploy and it does something that Docker doesn't do. That's a little plug there, but I actually haven't talked to him about what he does. But assuming that that's all true, like that's something that we know is going to be there in 3, 5, 10 years, and that somebody, there's going to be room for 3 or 4 container companies.
It looks like we already have some matchmaking happening in the panel itself, which is already
anyway. So I just think laser focus on the problem.
Yeah, so Ron, the closing remark on your end.
Sure. So in the last 15 years, I worked for 4 companies. One was public, 4 was startups. This is the 4th one. The first company failed. The second company went public. The third company got acquired. I hope our plan at ASOCS is to build a great business as well. I think it's about learning from the mistakes and keep improving and focus, like you say, but it's also about partnerships. I think if you're a startup, if you have the right partnerships around you and the right partnership with your target customers, then you can design yourself for success, basically.
If I may add a closing remark of myself, given that we're towards the end of the panel, I would say that it was clear that we're facing this big shift and disruption that is happening every couple of decades, I would say, even at the size that we're facing right now. It's a huge opportunity for startups, in my view, being a startup ourselves. I think that the comment that was mentioned here is, as a startup, you're not safe from being disrupted yourself. And that's a lesson that we keep on forgetting. Again, if I take the Puppet Chef example as a reference, so even as a startup that disrupts someone big, you're not safe from being disrupted yourself when you go and try to build your sustainable business model, especially at the stage of monetization. And I think that's something that we need to remember. On one hand, we have a lot of opportunity to disrupt the market. At the same time, we could be disrupted ourselves, and we need to plan for that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the panelists.
Thank you.